Hello, this is Sarah Miller. Before we dive in, I want you to picture this. A beautiful wedding, my sister glowing, and me, a 30-year-old novelist, about to have my life turned upside down. In just a few moments, my own father would strike me in front of everyone, all for a dusty old attic. But that single act of betrayal lit a fire in me, leading to a best-selling book and the downfall of a queen. Where are you watching this from today? I hope you'll subscribe, settle in, and listen to how I used my words to burn an empire to the ground. The champagne tasted like ash in my mouth. Outside, on the manicured lawns of the country club, my sister Amy was a vision in white, laughing as her new husband spun her around for a photograph. It was supposed to be the happiest day of our family's reconstituted life, but inside, under the glare of the crystal chandeliers, a storm was brewing, and its name was Linda, my stepmother. A woman whose smile was as sharp and thin as a shard of glass, cornered me by the ridiculously oversized wedding cake. "Sarah, darling," she began, her voice a sickly sweet honey that always set my teeth on edge. "Now that Amy's moved out, your father and I were thinking." I knew this tone. It was the prelude to a demand disguised as a reasonable suggestion. I braced myself, taking a fortifying sip of the bitter champagne. "That attic of yours?" she continued, gesturing vaguely in the direction of our family home across town. "It's such a waste of space. All those dusty books and that old furniture. We've been talking to a contractor. It would make a perfect little studio apartment. The rental income would be a great help." I stared at her, the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of the wedding guests fading into a dull roar in my ears. The attic. She called it, "that attic of yours," as if it were a spare room filled with forgotten junk. To me, it was everything. It was the last piece of my mother I had left. After she died when I was 10, it became my sanctuary. It was where I'd hidden from the grief, where I'd read her old books, and where, for the last decade, I had built my life as a writer. Every word of my novels had been typed under the gentle slope of its rafters, the scent of old wood and aging paper my constant companions. It wasn't a space, it was my soul, made manifest. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it felt as solid and heavy as a stone in the air between us. Linda's smile tightened. "Don't be sentimental, Sarah. It's a practical decision. We need the income. And you're barely there anyway, always cooped up writing." "I live there," I said, my voice gaining an edge of steel. "That's my home. Mom left it to me. It's in her will. You can't touch it." This was the crux of it. My mother, in a moment of foresight I was only now beginning to appreciate, had legally willed the finished attic and its separate entrance to me, ensuring I would always have a place of my own within the larger family house. For years, Linda had seen it as an insult, a ghost in her perfect domestic machine. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, flashed with anger. "Your father owns the house. That little piece of paper your mother signed won't stand up if he decides to challenge it. Don't be foolish." She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "You owe us this. After all we've done for you." I pulled my arm away. "You've done nothing for me," I hissed, the words raw and true. "You've spent the last 20 years trying to erase her, and now you want to pave over the last part of her that's left. The answer is no." That's when she played her trump card. Her face crumpled into a mask of theatrical hurt. She turned, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on my father, who was laughing with Amy's new in-laws. "Robert!" she called out, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. My father turned, his smile faltering as he saw Linda's face. He hurried over, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong, honey?" It's Sarah. Linda sobbed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a napkin. She's being so cruel. I just made a simple suggestion about the attic, about helping the family, and she said the most horrible things. She said I was trying to erase her mother. My father's face darkened. He turned to me, his gaze clouded with that familiar blend of confusion and misguided loyalty to the woman who had so expertly manipulated him for 2 decades. Sarah, what is this? Apologize to Linda. We're at your sister's wedding. I have nothing to apologize for, I said, my chin held high. She wants to kick me out of my home. Dad, Mom's attic. It's not just an attic. Robert, Linda whimpered. It's about respect. She has no respect for me, for you, for this family. Is that true, Sarah? My father asked, his voice low and dangerous. After everything we've given you, you can't show a little flexibility? A little gratitude? Gratitude for what? The question exploded out of me, years of resentment boiling over. For letting her throw out Mom's things? For letting her redecorate every room until there was no trace of her left? That attic is all I have, and you're just going to let her take it and turn it into a cheap rental for extra cash? The crowd around us had gone quiet. Amy was looking over, her perfect smile frozen on her face. The air was thick with tension. My father's face was turning a deep, mottled red. He was a man who hated public scenes, and Linda had just gift-wrapped one for him. You are an ungrateful, selfish child, he seethed, stepping closer. Linda is my wife. You will show her respect. Respect is earned, I shot back. And she has done nothing to earn mine. It happened faster than I could process. His hand, the same hand that had once taught me how to ride a bike and held mine at my mother's funeral, flew through the air. The sound was a sharp crack that silenced the entire room. My head snapped to the side, and a fiery sting erupted on my cheek. The shock was a physical blow, colder and deeper than the slap itself. My father had hit me. In the middle of my sister's wedding reception, at the behest of his manipulative wife. I raised my hand to my cheek, my fingers trembling. I looked at him, at the dawning horror in his own eyes as he realized what he'd done. I looked at Linda, who had a flicker of pure, triumphant venom in her gaze before she masked it with concern. And I looked at my sister, whose face was a portrait of helpless anguish, in that dead, ringing silence. A decision formed in my mind, not as a thought, but as a certainty. It was cold and clear and absolute. They wanted a war? They would get one. But I wouldn't fight with fists or shouts. I would fight with the only weapon I had ever truly mastered. My words. I turned without another word and walked out of the reception hall, leaving behind the shattered illusion of our family. The sting on my cheek was already fading, but the fire it had lit inside me was just beginning to burn. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and hot, silent tears. I didn't cry for the pain on my cheek, but for the final, brutal severing of a bond I hadn't even realized I was still clinging to. The fantasy of the father I remembered, the one from before Linda, died in that ballroom. By the time I climbed the familiar wooden stairs to my attic, the grief had already begun to harden into resolve. I unlocked the door, and the scent of home, that unique mix of old paper, cedar, and faint, lingering lavender from my mother's old sachets, wrapped around me like a hug. This was my fortress, and they had just laid siege to it. The attic wasn't just a room. It was a living museum of my past, a testament to the woman they were trying to erase. In one corner stood her old reading chair, a worn wingback of faded chintz where she'd read to me from books that now lined my shelves. Against the far wall were her old steamer trunks, filled not with clothes, but with her journals, photo albums, and letters. I ran my hand over the cool, brass latch of one of them, a callback to a time when my world felt safe. For 20 years, Linda had treated these artifacts as junk to be cleared out. For me, they were my armor. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dust motes dancing in the single beam of moonlight from the dormer window. For a long time, I just stared at the blank document, the cursor blinking like a patient, expectant heartbeat. How do you distill 20 years of quiet manipulations, of subtle cruelties and gaslighting, into a story? How do you explain the slow poisoning of a family to people who only saw the perfect, smiling facade Linda presented to the world? The answer, I realized, was that I wouldn't explain it. I would show it. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the clicks echoing in the silent space. I didn't start with the slap. I started with the small things. I wrote about the first time Linda accidentally donated a box of my mother's favorite books to Goodwill. I wrote about the way she'd praise me with backhanded compliments in front of her friends. Sarah is so dedicated to her writing. She hardly has time for anything else. It's a shame she's such a homebody. I wrote about the family vacations where my father and Linda would share a luxurious suite, while I was put in a small, adjoining room, a subtle but constant reminder of my status as an add-on, a leftover from a previous life. Each memory was a ghost I was finally giving a voice. I pulled out my mother's journals. Her elegant cursive filled the pages, speaking of her love for my father, her hopes for me, and, in the final months, a growing, uneasy awareness of Linda, who had started as a helpful friend to my father at his office. My mother had seen the ambition in Linda's eyes long before anyone else. She looks at our life, not with friendship, my mother had written, but with appraisal. That sentence became a chapter title. I wrote with a feverish intensity, the story pouring out of me not as a fictional narrative, but as a testimony. The protagonist, a young woman named Anna, lived in a gabled attic, a sanctuary left to her by her beloved, deceased mother. The villain was Clarice, a stepmother with a dazzling public smile and a private penchant for psychological warfare. I changed the names, tweaked the settings, but the emotional truth was raw and unfiltered. I described Clarice's talent for isolating Anna from her father, for twisting her words, for making her feel like a stranger in her own home. I detailed Clarice's obsession with money, her constant talk of investments and income streams, and her disdain for anything she considered sentimental nonsense, which included all of Anna's mother's possessions. The attic in the book, just like my own, became the final battleground, a symbol of memory and identity against the onslaught of avarice and revisionist history. Days turned into a week, then two. I lived on coffee and toast, the world outside my window ceasing to exist. My phone buzzed with texts from Amy, alternating between worried and angry. My father left voicemails, his tone shifting from demanding an apology to a strained, hollow plea to just talk this out. I ignored them all. My only communication was with the ghosts in the room and the words on the screen. One night, exhausted, I slumped back in my chair and reread the first 50 pages. It was brutal. It was honest. And it was good. I had captured her, not just Linda, but the archetype of the narcissistic, manipulative interloper. I had captured the grief of a daughter and the weakness of a father caught in a web of his own making. The dialogue was sharp, laced with the subtext and passive aggression I had spent a lifetime decoding. In that moment, I knew this was more than just revenge. It was a reclamation. Linda and my father had tried to take my home, my past, and my dignity. They had tried to silence me, but here, in the quiet solitude of my mother's attic, I was taking it all back, one word at a time. The manuscript wasn't just a book, it was my voice, finally screaming out of the silence, and I had a feeling it was going to be loud enough for the whole world to hear. The first draft of The Attic was a raw, throbbing nerve of a manuscript, written in a 3-month fugue state. I sent it to my agent with a simple note. "I think this is the one." She called me 2 days later, her voice electric. "Sarah," she said, "this is not just a book. It's a confession. It's a declaration of war. Who is this woman?" I gave her a vague answer, but she didn't need the details. The emotional honesty was what mattered. She sold it in a week. The news of the book deal rippled through our small town of Maple Creek with the speed of a lit fuse. I hadn't told anyone, but my agent had put out a press release, and small towns have their own information networks. The advance was significant, enough to make the local paper. Local author Sarah Miller sells debut novel. It didn't mention the subject matter, but it didn't have to. Linda knew. Her counteroffensive began immediately. It wasn't a direct assault, but a whispering campaign, a masterful work of propaganda. Suddenly, old family friends were looking at me with pity. People at the grocery store would fall silent when I walked down the aisle. The narrative Linda was painting was one of a troubled, mentally unstable daughter, consumed by jealousy and grief, who had become delusional. She told people I was a recluse who never got over my mother's death. She hinted that the fictional story I'd written was a cry for help, a twisted fantasy born of a fragile mind. She even managed to poison my sister, Amy. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Amy pleaded over the phone, her voice strained. "Linda is heartbroken. Dad is a wreck. She said you've been having some episodes, that you're twisting things from the past. Why are you trying to tear this family apart over a room?" "She's lying, Amy," I said, my voice tired. "She's been lying to you, to Dad, for 20 years. The book is the truth." "It's a novel," she cried. "It's not the truth. It's your version of it. You need help." She hung up before I could reply. The isolation was crushing. Linda was an artist, and her medium was public opinion. She was turning my own story against me before it was even published, framing me as the villain. My father, predictably, was her silent, miserable accomplice. He'd drive by the house, sometimes just sitting in his car across the street, looking up at the attic window. He never got out. He was a man trapped. And a part of me, a small, stubborn part, still felt a pang of pity for him. But Linda's campaign, for all its viciousness, had an unintended effect. It made me more determined. It forced me to go back to the manuscript, not just as a writer, but as a journalist. I had to be unassailable. Every emotional truth needed to be buttressed by hard, verifiable facts. I started digging, not into my own memories, but into public records. I wanted to understand who Linda was before she became my stepmother. I spent hours at the county clerk's office and the library archives, scrolling through microfiche of old newspapers. It started with a hunch. In the book, the stepmother, Clarice, was obsessed with acquiring property and had a history of charming wealthy, older men. It was a character trait I'd written to explain her obsession with my attic. I decided to see if life had imitated art, and then I found it. A small article in the Maple Creek Gazette from 25 years ago. It mentioned a Linda Parsons, her maiden name, who had been the business partner of a local real estate developer named Arthur Vance. He had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving his entire, surprisingly modest, estate to her. His children had contested the will, claiming undue influence, but with no proof. The case was dropped. The story was a small-town tragedy, quickly forgotten. But something about it felt wrong. I kept digging. I found their business incorporation papers. I found property deeds they had co-signed. And then, the first crack in her fortress appeared. I found a record of a lawsuit filed by a former supplier against their defunct development company, Vance and Parsons Properties. The supplier claimed they were never paid for tens of thousands of dollars in materials for a housing project that was never completed. The company had declared bankruptcy shortly after Arthur Vance's death. Its assets mysteriously vanished. Linda had walked away with his personal estate, while all the business's debts were dissolved. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. This was a pattern, a carefully executed playbook. Find a target with assets, build trust, isolate them, and then, when the time is right, take everything. My father wasn't her first. He was just the latest, and perhaps the most successful, of her projects. I looked at the faded newspaper article, at the picture of a younger Linda standing beside a portly, smiling Arthur Vance. The smile was the same. The eyes held the same cool, appraising glint. She hadn't just moved into my mother's house. She had conquered it. And the attic wasn't just about rental income. It was about finishing the job, erasing the last remnant of a prior claim, the last piece of unconquered territory. I went back to my manuscript, my fingers flying. I wove in a new subplot for Clarice, a backstory about a former business partner who died under convenient circumstances, leaving her everything. I didn't use the real names or details, but the blueprint was there for anyone who knew where to look. Linda's smear campaign had been meant to bury me. Instead, she had just handed me a shovel, and I was about to dig up all her bones. The day The Attic was published, a quiet terror settled in my stomach. It was one thing to write the words in the sanctuary of my room. It was another to send them out into the world, to be read by neighbors, friends, and enemies. The initial release was a national success. Critics praised its raw emotional power, its unflinching look at the complexities of a blended family, and the insidious nature of psychological abuse. It became a book club favorite, resonating with people, especially women over 45, who saw their own quiet struggles reflected in Anna's story. But I wasn't watching the bestseller lists. I was watching Maple Creek. For the first week, there was an eerie silence. It was the calm before the storm. Linda and my father were conspicuously absent from their usual social haunts. Then, the first tremor hit. It came from Mr. Abernathy, who owned the old hardware store on Main Street. He was a contemporary of Arthur Vance, the real estate developer I'd discovered in my research. He called me, his voice raspy with age and emotion. "Miss Miller," he said, "I just finished your book. My wife, she made me read it. That character, Clarice, the story about her old business partner, that was Arthur, wasn't it?" "I wrote a work of fiction, Mr. Abernathy," I said carefully, my heart pounding. "Fiction. My foot." He scoffed. "You wrote the truth. I was the one who supplied the lumber for that last project of his, Vance and Parsons Properties. Never saw a dime after Arthur died. Clarice. She told me the company was broke, that Arthur had left a mountain of debt. She cried in my office, right there in that chair you're probably picturing. And I believed her. I wrote it off as a bad debt." My hand was shaking as I held the phone. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "Don't you be sorry, girl," he said, his voice hardening. "You opened my eyes. After I read that chapter, I called up 2 other contractors who got burned on that deal. We're talking now. We're pulling out the old paperwork." That was the first crack in the dam. The book, with its fictionalized account, had given people a new lens through which to view their own past experiences with Linda. It was a Rosetta Stone for her deceit. 2 days later, A woman who had been in Linda's bridge club for years posted a long, scathing review of the book on the town's community Facebook page. "This book is being sold as fiction," she wrote. "But for those of us who live in Maple Creek, it reads like a biography." I've always had a strange feeling about Linda. The way she'd subtly turn people against each other. The way she'd forget to pay back small debts. The story she told about her modest inheritance from her parents that didn't quite add up. This book connects the dots. I, for one, stand with Sarah Miller. The post exploded. Suddenly, everyone had a story. A woman who worked at the country club talked about how Linda treated the staff the moment she thought no one was looking. A former neighbor mentioned how Linda had convinced her elderly mother to invest in a can't-miss stock that promptly became worthless. Each story, on its own, was a minor slight, a piece of gossip. But together, woven into the public narrative my book had created, they formed a devastating mosaic of a lifelong predator. The most shocking revelation came from a quiet woman who had been my mother's closest friend, Eleanor. She came to my attic, her face pale, a worn leather-bound book in her hand. It was my mother's daily planner from the year she died. "I should have given this to you years ago, Sarah," she said, her voice thick with regret. "But I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't think anyone would believe me." She opened it to the last few weeks. My mother's neat script detailed several meetings and lunches with Linda. But the notes in the margins told a different story. Linda pressuring Dad about his will again. Ellie suggested I'm spending too much on my frivolous hobbies. And the final, chilling entry from 2 days before the aneurysm that took her life. Linda made a comment about my headaches, said I should get my affairs in order, just in case. It felt less like concern and more like a threat. I feel so cold. It wasn't proof of a crime, but it was proof of a campaign. A long, patient, cruel war of attrition waged against a sick woman. Linda hadn't just married a widower. She had, in her own way, helped create one. My book was no longer just my story. It had become the town's story. It was the story of Arthur Vance, of Mr. Abernathy, of my mother. I was no longer the crazy, vengeful daughter. I was a chronicler, a truth-teller. The reckoning I had sought for myself was now a town-wide bonfire. And Linda, the self-appointed queen of Maple Creek, was standing right in the middle of the flames. The downfall was not a sudden, dramatic explosion, but a slow, agonizing crumble, which was far more satisfying. Linda's power had always been perception, the image of the perfect wife, the savvy businesswoman, the charitable pillar of the community. My book, and the chorus of voices it had unleashed, shattered that image irrevocably. The whispers that had once followed me down grocery store aisles now followed her. The invitations stopped coming. Her calls went unreturned. When she walked into the country club, the tables fell silent. She had become a pariah in the kingdom she had so meticulously built. The final, crushing blow came from my father. He showed up at my door one evening, looking 10 years older. He was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out with a shame so profound it was almost difficult to look at. He didn't try to come up the stairs to the attic. He just stood on the landing below, like a supplicant. "The Abernathys are suing us," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "And the Vances, Arthur Vance's sons. They're reopening the probate case. They have affidavits from 3 other contractors. Her name is on everything. My name is on some of it." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "I didn't know. Sarah, I swear to you, I didn't know the extent of it. She explained everything away. I was a fool. I chose to believe the easy lies instead of the hard truth." "Yes," I said, my voice devoid of pity. You were. She wants me to sell the house to pay for the lawyers, he said, the words catching in his throat. She wants to sell your mother's house. He finally broke, his shoulders slumping as he choked back a sob. I can't. I won't. It's all I have left of her. Really. And there it was. The great irony. In her desperate bid to seize the last piece of my mother's legacy, Linda was about to lose the whole thing. The house was his anchor to the past he had let her desecrate. And now, faced with losing it, he finally found a sliver of the backbone he'd misplaced 20 years ago. I never learned the full details of their final confrontation. I only know that a week later, Linda's car was gone, her closets were empty. She had taken a settlement from my father, a fraction of what she'd hoped for, and disappeared. Maple Creek had cast her out. There was nothing left for her here. My father and I began the slow, awkward process of rebuilding something from the rubble. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. He started telling me stories about my mother, small memories he had kept locked away. It was his penance. My sister Amy came to me, tail between her legs, full of apologies. She had finally seen the truth, and she was ashamed of her blindness. Our relationship, too, began to heal, forged anew in the wake of the storm. My book, The Attic, hit #1 on the bestseller list. I was invited on talk shows and to writers' festivals. I became known as a voice for those who had been silenced. But my greatest triumph wasn't the fame or the sales. It was standing in my attic, looking out the window at the familiar maple tree my mother had planted, and feeling a profound sense of peace. The room was no longer a fortress against the world. It was a foundation from which to build a new one. The air was still thick with the scent of old wood and paper. But now, it was mingled with the clean, fresh scent of freedom. I had fought for my sanctuary, for my mother's memory, for my own truth, and I had won. The attic was mine. Its ghosts were finally at peace, and for the first time in a very long time, so was I. The war is over. The silence that fills this attic now is not one of fear or hiding, but of tranquility. Looking back, I realized that revenge was only the spark. The true fire was the pursuit of truth. Linda's greatest weapon was her ability to control the narrative, to make people doubt their own reality. My victory wasn't just in exposing her lies, but in reclaiming my own story, and, in doing so, giving others the courage to reclaim theirs. The slap at the wedding was meant to put me in my place, to remind me that I was powerless. Instead, it showed me where my true power lay, not in my fists, but in my words. This attic, once a symbol of what I stood to lose, is now a testament to what I was willing to fight for. It's a reminder that a home is not just walls and a roof, but a sacred space where our truth can live and breathe. Justice, I've learned, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it's about the quiet, unshakable peace that comes from finally being heard. What does the idea of home mean to you? Have you ever had to fight for something that was rightfully yours? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter.